Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to the Stanley Dyrector Show. We have a terrific guest for you folks, Stephen Douglas Hayes. It sounds historical, makes me hysterical, because I know this gentleman for many years, and he's written a book, and it's called The Writing of History. Mr. Hayes, welcome to the Stanley Dyrector Show.
It's good to see you and good to be here, Stanley.
Well, tell us about your book, The History or The Writing of History.
This is a book about two German generals who had the nerve to write a book in 1952. These are historical figures, and never mentioned the Nazis or any of the political programs of Germany from 1939 to 1945. So you just think about the nerve it took to sit down and just write this thing when both of them knew everything that was going on. So I decided to write this book and to call it The Writing of History, which is ironic because they didn't write the history. They wrote the pseudo-history. They just glossed over what was really happening from 39 to 45.
In other words, this book was a published book. The
yes.
book that...
Yeah.
Right. In your book here, The Writing of History, though you have these two German generals, one is interviewing the other. Blumentritt is interviewing von Rundstedt, and you're having von Rundstedt having guilty feelings about the Holocaust, about Hitler's orders and all that kind of stuff. I mean, isn't that kind of like...
That was the point of the book, Stanley, because what I did was I gave von Rundstedt a conscience. Now, I never met the man. He was dead in 1952, and maybe he didn't have a conscience.
I would say he didn't have a conscience.
Except I gave him one.
You gave him a conscience.
And
okay.
I had him expose to his friend Blumentritt all of these second thoughts and doubts that he had all through the war, from 33 on through to 52 when he died, and no one ever wrote them down. Maybe he never had these thoughts, but I gave them to him, and I said, if he did think like this, if he did have a conscience, here's what he would have said.
So you as an author
took enormous liberties.
Took enormous liberties, and also took upon your shoulders a big burden to try and, I guess, convince us that this guy, if he did have a conscience, would have
acted this way.
Right,
and that's why I put the other two.
But he didn't have a conscience because millions of people were assassinated. In concentration camps, and there were Catholics, Jews, Gypsies, all of them. So you got a lot of nerve, pal. I admire the fact that you did craft this book so well, and that there are sympathetic characters.
Well,
in this book.
The two other characters in the book besides the two generals, the driver and the housekeeper,
right.
Kurt and Anna, they were typical Germans. And Anna was a Nazi, but she was a Nazi the way you may be a Republican or a Democrat.
Uh-huh.
And you would not agree with a third or a quarter maybe of the policies of the Republicans or Democrats, but you're in this country. You're going to be, and that's how she became a Nazi. She was in Germany. There was some good things they did, believe it or not, and that in the 30s she never felt she had a choice. In fact, the Hitler Youth was never a matter of choice. It was an act of legislation that Hitler just decided all of the youth in Germany were now Hitler Youth. So no one had a choice whether they were Hitler Youth or not.
Right. You painted a lot of subtlety in something that could have been painted with a broad brush.
Well, thank you, Stanley. That's quite a compliment, I guess.
Well, it's meant to be. What I found interesting, and I guess it's your research in history, because I know you're a historian and quite adept at James Joyce and all these great writers like Hemingway. Hitler was actually elected democratically, wasn't he?
Well, he got about 41% of the vote. And there were many parties in Germany at the time. And in 1932, that last election they had, he got about 40%, and there was a front called the Harzburg Front. And it was headed by von Papen and Hjalmar Horace Greeley Schacht. That was really his name. He was a fine Schacht.
Go West, young man?
Yes, Hjalmar Horace Greeley Schacht is a great name.
Yeah.
But that was really his name. And they decided that, and they represented the money, the big money in Germany, and they took their 10% and voted with Hitler. So Hindenburg had to name a chancellor. He was the president of the Republic at the time. And he had no choice, because between Hitler and this front, they had a majority. So he made Hitler chancellor, and at that point, Hitler just took over. And he just started shooting people out of hand, and they just imposed their will on the state. And the German people went along with it because he was so successful. They were trying to undo the horrors of Versailles, which was the treaty that ended the First World War, and the French and the Italians and the British had heaped all of the problems of the world onto the Germans, which really wasn't true. And the Germans felt that their country had been dismembered. The French had occupied the Rhineland. They took back Alsace and Lorraine, and there were parts of the Polish corridor that they felt were Germany. And then they felt there were Germans living in Czechoslovakia and Sudetenland, and that Austria should be part of Germany also, because they were all German-speaking people. And no matter what else you might say about Hitler, he was the only German leader ever to have all of the German-speaking people in Europe under one flag. No one, not even Charlemagne, no one, or Frederick the Great, no one had ever done it. So there was evidently something he tapped into, this pan-German nationalism, that made him what he was.
A very dangerous
a
dangerous person.
Right,
I mean, but you know what was interesting in the writing of history, and probably lacking in my education, but I was educated by the fact that Germany just marched into Paris in 1940. I mean, there
was a war, but it only lasted 3 weeks.
I mean, they just gave up like that, France?
They didn't give up. It's the French had it's interesting. Right after the First World War, the Germans were restricted by the Treaty of Versailles, and they were not allowed to have an army, 100,000 men, period. Okay. But they built one secretly with the collusion of the Russians, believe it or not. And a Jew, who I point out in this book by the name of Walter Rathenau, who negotiated these treaties that enabled that army to expand. And then Hitler, the Free Corps, actually before Hitler, they murdered him because he was a Jew. But the treaties had restricted him. The French, who had no restrictions, but still had a large army, but they invested all of their money and their psychological impulse in the Maginot Line, which was a defensive position. And then, during the First World War, they were living in mud-filled trenches. Right. Here they had built this beautiful, it was like like the metro. Right. They figured if there was going to be another war, it would be just like the last one, and they would sit there in this defensive position. Well, when the war started, or when Hitler attacked them, the war started in 1939, and then after Poland was over, they turned around and attacked France. The Germans just bypassed the Maginot Line. They went right by it, and it was useless. But it shows the psychology of the two nations. The Germans wanted to get even. The French wanted to defend their territory.
And, the French Jews, though, they were turned in by the French.
Well, of course. And the Italian Jews and everywhere,
Yeah,
that was the horror.
I believe the Italians, though, they, at one time historically, you might have mentioned that in your book, where the Italian soldiers kind of went on strike against the Nazis and said, hey, you better not touch those Jews.
Worse than that, at Annecy, they surrounded...
better than that.
They surrounded the SS barracks and said, we're going to kill you all. They had loaded a train
up with Jews. In other words, the Italians were going to kill all the Germans,
the
Nazis.
Right, because they had a train load of Jews that were about to send to Auschwitz.
Yeah.
And actually the Germans had to give up. They couldn't enforce this thing, and the Italian army was there, and they let all the Jews go. So as I pointed out in the book, the Italian army, which was not a good army,
It was a ragtag kind of
survived
army, right?
the war with honor, and the German generals, the German army did not.
Right.
They were dishonored. But as the housekeeper and the driver keep pointing out, they had not lost their humanity. They had some knowledge of what was going on, but it wasn't that they knew exactly what was happening. It was the same thing in this country. We have 2.5 million people in jails. We're executing, every state is executing people every day. You don't consider yourself a murderer. How many of those people that are being killed do you...
Yeah, but
You're
Steve,
saying it's not the same.
Steve, it isn't the same to me. I mean, you know, the German people at that time were... Some of them were aware of what was happening.
No question.
And then didn't open their damn mouth a bit because they were afraid of their own ass.
Some of them did. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he resisted right up, and the Germans ended. He was a Protestant minister, Lutheran, and they ended up hanging him. And then there was a circle called the White Rose, where there were German students who disagreed with the Nazis vehemently, and they would write papers against them and everything. And Hitler and Goebbels had them shot or hung.
Yeah, well, yeah, but I mean, I still feel that that era, I mean, it's been, you know, they've talked about it and history has been written and...
The point is, the history has not been written. What's been written is Rundstedt's point of view. This is the history.
Okay, so you're different, you've given him a conscience.
Right.
In his book, he's saying, why didn't I do this?
Right.
Why didn't I do that?
Right.
And all that.
And he ends up by saying, Germany was wrong, Martin Luther was wrong, investing your honor in a state is wrong.
Right. Martin Luther, we're talking about the...
not Martin Luther King, but Martin Luther, 1518.
1518, who
created Protestantism.
Right. And who was, what, anti-Semitic or something
He
like
was
that?
He was an anti-Semite, yes. But he believed that...
Like Henry Ford, right?
Maybe worse. Luther was virulent. He said, burn the synagogues, get all the Jews out of Germany. And here he created this religion that half the world turned around and became Protestants.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of like a, I guess you might say, I don't know what to say, actually. Talk to me, because I'm at a loss for words.
Well, Luther not only was anti-Semitic, but he also advised all of the German people, and he ended up being the most influential man in Europe for the next 500 years, to obey the state. The state, in Luther's mind, could do no wrong. So that when you get to the Second World War and you get to Hitler, all of a sudden Hitler is the state. He's not this wacko singing.
Right, but he was a wacko.
Now he's the state. He becomes the Führer.
Right.
The great political programs the Germans had: one Reich, one land, and one Führer.
But they had the I was going to say the balls to say, God is with us. Gott mit us.
Said it on the belt buckles.
God, I mean, they got to be rotting in hell, I would think.
That was the other point that Rundstedt comes to, is that on the German army, the German soldiers, on their belt buckle was written, Gott mit uns, God with us. And it finally dawns on Rundstedt that the God is the God they got from the Hebrews. It's the same God.
Right.
And here they are killing the people who gave them the God.
Right.
They are now murdering.
Right. Steve, I think you're a nice guy, and I think this is a very, as I say, interesting and controversial piece of work, the writing of history. But let me veer away from that for a few minutes and ask you. I know you a long time. What authors, I think I might have mentioned Hemingway, inspired you to write, to be a writer? I mean, it took you a long time to write this book, didn't it? Or a long process, a long road?
Well, I wrote it 30 years ago. Stanley.
What?
Yeah, and it was originally it was like 100,000 words. Now it's down to about 40,000 words. And when I was writing it, I was driving Orson Welles. And Wells had an idea in his head
Oh,
at
you
the
were a
time.
driver, too.
I was a driver, yeah.
Okay.
And Wells had an idea in his mind that he wanted to do a piece about the Holocaust.
Right.
And I had all this literature and stuff, and Wells always had to ride in the front of the car because he had gotten so fat he couldn't get in the back. And if he did, you couldn't get him out.
Right.
So he would see all this, and he said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm writing this book about these German generals." He said, "Let me read that when you're done." So I said, "Sure," and I finished it and had it typed up, and I let him read it. And he was amazed. He loved it. He really did like it. And he said, "If you could ever get this published, you could win a Pulitzer Prize." And I said, "What does that mean, Orson?" He said, "Well, you're never going to get this published." Now, this is 30 years ago, remember? He said, "No publishers." And I said, "Well, why wouldn't they publish it?" And he said, "Who are you?" And I knew exactly what he was talking about. Who was I? A dumb limousine driver from San Diego, from Southern California. Why would they write a book that I had written about Rinstead and the writing of history? And he was probably right. But in this day and age, with the advent of the internet and the web and the new technology, you can get a book like this published for a very small cost compared to what the investment that would have been had to make in a book like this 30 years ago.
So is this self-published?
This is yes, I published this myself.
Okay. How does one? We have a lot of listeners, actually viewers of this show. How does one?
You can go on Amazon. It's probably available there right now.
But I mean, how do you get? In other words, give me the process of getting something published.
There are 4 or 5 or 6 different internet or publishers.
Okay.
And you contact one of them, and they charge you about $1,000 to publish a book. And you have to send them the copy, all edited, all ready to print. And they will set the type and print it for you. And you'll end up with a book like this. This is only 94 pages. Like I said, 40,000 words.
Which took you 30 years to write.
No, I wrote it 30 years ago. But the words are pithy, let me tell you.
Yeah, very, well, isn't that from your Hemingway days, right? Weren't you?
Maybe. I used to be a Hemingway fan. And
well, did you study with anybody to learn the art of writing, literature?
Writing was something I could always do. When I was 12 years old, in fact, I mentioned it on the blurb in the back, I had a public school teacher by the name of Carl Fenischel, and he gave me the English medal. It was the first one the school had ever awarded for literary excellence. And he would have me go around and read my little essays and stories and what have you to other classes and to everybody in the school. And writing was always something I could do. So, but having something to say versus writing are 2 different worlds.
Well, what do you want to say? What would your next project be? I mean, what do you really want to say with your heart? Let me hear that. I know you got this book, but what does Steve Hayes want to say? Stephen Douglas Hayes. I don't want to know about other people. What do you want to say?
Well, I have another book that's coming out probably in a couple of weeks called 1968, and it's about the students and the SDS. In 1960,
what's the SDS?
That was the Students for a Democratic Society,
okay.
And they ended up segueing into the Weathermen. I don't know if you ever heard.
The underground Weathermen.
Yeah, they were throwing bombs and
nutcases.
They were just extreme. That's
all right, go ahead.
They were throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
right, go ahead.
But anyway, the SDS. There were a lot of very well-meaning kids in that, and they wanted to enforce political changes.
Right.
And it was a very simple agenda. They wanted to make America more democratic, and they wanted the attitude toward the blacks changed. That was their big agenda in '68.
Well, what do you mean? The Jim Crow?
Of course.
Jim Crow still around in 1968?
Of course he was. He may not be gone yet, but he was there through the 70s.
Why? We have somebody running for president who has a good shot at becoming president.
This is 40 years later, Stanley.
Oh, okay.
Not 1968. You couldn't have run him. But that's the year also that Johnson decided not to run because of all the student demonstrations against him. And
women's rights.
There were no women's rights in '68.
Racial equality, racial equality.
Right.
Well, in California there was, though. I remember.
Well,
California was
legally we had it in the country in 1866, 65, and 66. The Democrats passed all that legislation, Amendment 13, 14, and 15 of the Constitution, which gave everybody equal rights.
Yeah.
But it never translated into anything for the blacks because of Jim Crow and the attitudes of the whites in the North. They just went along. They did not rock the boat. Sammy Davis, poor soul, I know you met him, and I had known him a little, and he was the sweetest man that ever lived. He'd go to Vegas. He's the biggest star in the world. He couldn't stay at the hotel on the Strip. He had to go over to Henderson or wherever it was that the blacks were allowed to stay. That was in the 60s. So, these are the kind of changes that these students were trying to bring about. And this book of mine, 1968, which will be out right after this, within a week or two.
You address that issue?
This is the issues that's being addressed, and how these students tried to get into the political system and couldn't do it. They kept getting marginalized by the sitting parties, the Democrats and the Republicans.
Right.
And that's what the people in power do. They marginalize everybody that doesn't agree with them, and they make them look like they're some kind of a wacko.
Steve, you and I were in the Navy together. I'm not going to say when or what. And we were patriots for the United States of America. And we fought in a war. Being veterans, do you have any second thoughts about writing a book about our former enemy? That's all I got to ask you. I got to throw that back at you.
Well, it's...
guys were dying where we were. And history has shown people dying.
No question, the Japanese and the Germans just, they swallowed these glasses full of fanatical right-wing fascist rhetoric, and they decided to take the world over.
Right.
And we joined this bunch of people who decided they weren't going to take the world over, and here was this war.
Right.
And it was in our laps after Pearl Harbor. And Hitler, as I mentioned in the book also, he declared war on America after Pearl Harbor, while he was busy attacking Russia. So, show you his madness, he ensured his defeat by creating this huge second front before he had even conquered the Russians.
Right.
So he had a two-front war on his hands, which he knew he couldn't win. His generals knew it. But at that point, the generals had thrown in the towel, and they didn't think they could bring about a political change, because Hitler, right up to the end, was enormously popular in Germany. Everybody loved him because of how he had gotten the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles pushed aside and reestablished the Germans' pride.
Right, but when people did find out the real truth, they realized that he was a bastard.
Have they found out the real truth?
How? Well, geez, I mean, I see documentaries, I've read books. They did find out the truth. He was a cruel, sadistic, masochistic son of a bitch.
Well, he had this thing where he was going to kill every Jew in the world if he had the chance. But personally, he loved children. It's like the Mel Brooks, where he says, Churchill couldn't dance. He has that crazy guy in the producers. He says, Hitler could dance.
Yeah.
But Hitler did have a personality, and something did come across to the German people.
Right.
And it wasn't the sadistic, murdering son of a bitch. He was only that to the Jews.
Right.
And to anybody who he considered the enemy.
Right.
The horror with Hitler was, if he had succeeded and killed all the Jews, he immediately would have had something else to hate. He was the original Big Brother. You had to have that 3 minutes of hate.
He had colonies in Africa. What are you talking about, Germany? Hitler was shown up at the 32 Olympics? Was it 32? 1932?
36.
36
32 was here in Los Angeles.
Okay, 36. And who was the great runner?
Jesse Owens.
Jesse Owens blew Hitler's mind. How a black man could win, and become the fastest guy around.
Yeah, but it didn't do anything to change the German policies, and it didn't do anything at all to change Hitler's mind or his his psychological impulse to take the world into this disaster that he had imagined not only for himself, but for everybody else.
You know, Steve, the writing of history, very interesting. When are you going to write a comedy? That's what I want to know. I mean, you've known a lot of funny people. You've known Mel Brooks and people like that.
Actually, I'm writing one right now, Stanley.
You are?
And I'll give you the premise of it.
Okay.
It's interesting. Do we have a few minutes?
I think we got, what, a minute? Go ahead.
We have a minute.
Okay.
There's this guy who had a horrible life. He was like an usher or a guy at the track who opened the doors for people. And he hated his life. And he gets to be 60, and he sees a picture in the Foreign Legion magazine of some legionnaires going into Vietnam, paratroopers, and one of them looks exactly like him. So he adopts the persona of this legionnaire, and he creates this history for himself of I was in the Legion. And everybody sees the picture, and they didn't know his past, and they said, hey, this is great, Bill, you were a legionnaire. And all of a sudden he has some cachet. And that's what this book is about. All of these people who get together and decide they're not going to live with the past that they've lived, but they're going to create a past that is a little more agreeable to what they felt should have happened to them.
You know, Steve Hayes, you're a very articulate guy. As we're going to soon wrap up the show, give our audience out there some advice on writing, because you certainly have paid your dues.
Well,
give it fast.
It's like Bernard Shaw said, 5 pages a day. Just sit yourself down in a chair and write yourself 5 pages a day and have something to say.
Okay, you have to have something to say. You know, I'll tell you what, I'm going to let you take me out to lunch today. Thank you very much for being
always good
a
to
guest
see you.
on
Thank
my
you
show,
for having
Stephen.
me, Stanley.
The writing of history, ladies and gentlemen. If you have a chance, you look at it and decide for yourself.